Why are we silent when Tibet needs our voices?
Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity
And of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family
is the foundation of freedom, justice,
and peace in the world.
Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights
resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind.
Article 5, no one shall be subjected to torture
or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment.
Article 19, everyone has the right to
Freedom of opinion and expression.
Everyone has the right to freedom
to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion.
And freedoms set forth
herein.
Welcome to Dateline. I'm Helen Vatsikopoulos. Tonight, the US launches a war against terrorism. Later in the program, we'll be discussing the risks of that strategy. First, though, a Dateline special on the Tibetan exile community. Over 130,000 Tibetans and their leader, the Dalai Lama, fled Chinese rule and now live in India. This week, Chinese authorities said they were free to return to Tibet providing they give up their independence struggle. A surprising offer, given the Dalai Lama's repeatedly said he'll settle for autonomy. Maybe it's a result of President Clinton's recent visit to China, when he urged the Chinese to negotiate with the Dalai Lama. Meanwhile, some 5,000 Tibetans continue to escape each year, making the perilous crossing over the Himalayan mountains. Amanda Collins has been to meet them in the heights of northern India, where she discovers an exile community growing increasingly impatient. And a warning, there's a self-immolation scene in this story that is disturbing.
In the foothills of the Indian Himalaya, Tibetan monks give thanks to one of their most revered deities. It was Padmasambhava, they say, who introduced Buddhism to Tibet and used his magic powers to transform evil spirits into protectors of the Dharma, the sacred law. It's a performance of ritual tantric dancing that lasts for 9 hours. It's rare to see, and even rarer to be able to document such ancient rites. For in Tibet, religious expression like this is forbidden. And before the Chinese invaded Tibet, very little like this was captured on film. Tibetan heritage is now quite literally in danger of extinction.
The whole question of Tibetan culture and race is at stake, whether they will survive or not.
Tibetan women are being sterilized and Tibetan population is being controlled. Religious freedom is not being given.
If you look at the development within Tibet, then yes, it is true, time is running out. We can't wait.
Further up the mountains in the region called Ladakh, there's excitement on the streets. The Dalai Lama is in town, and this morning thousands have flocked to hear his teachings. Since the Dalai Lama fled the Chinese occupation of Tibet in 1959, more than 100,000 exiles have followed him to take up refuge in India. Here in Ladakh, nearly 7,000 of them have settled. Today they've come from hill stations and mountain villages. Even the old and sick have come to hear their very own Nobel laureate. For exiles like these, unsure they'll ever return to Tibet, this man is their one hope, their ray of pure light in a darkening world. There's a healthy sprinkling here too of Westerners, seeking enlightenment and relief from the hype and cynicism of the 90s. By lunchtime, the Himalayan sun is fierce, and the Dalai Lama retreats to his summer palace. It's here in the palace grounds that we find him, feeding a wounded bird he's been nursing back to health.
If we show to them genuine sort of concern and affection, they also respond accordingly. Then when you receive someone with their sort of friendly attitude, you feel satisfaction. Yeah. Isn't it?
Tibet's political and spiritual leader is today bubbling with optimism. He's just had news of Bill Clinton's recent visit to China, and he's convinced it bodes well for Tibet.
China proper becoming more open society, more freedom of expression. As a result, more and more Chinese, especially among the intellectuals, some writers, now openly criticize their own government's policy and openly supported about my middle approach.
Aren't you disturbed by the growing number of Western nations who now use a policy of constructive engagement towards China?
No. I think that's right. That's right way, I think. The China isolate, wrong. In any case, the Chinese, the China, the most populated nation, long history, and very rich cultural heritage. And in any case, the big potential of economic power. Then I think the rest of the world have the moral responsibility to bring China into the mainstream of world democracy. And then, you see, it will be much safer. But how to bring democracy? Not, you see, the negative way, but make friend, reduce, the distrust.
But not all Tibetans agree with the Dalai Lama's approach of peaceful negotiation. Now, for the first time, dissident voices are demanding a tougher line with China.
It's just like the recent visit of Clinton to China. So, Clinton is going to raise, Tibet is very high on his agenda. It is high on his agenda as a card to negotiate with China. for his own interest, for US interest, not for Tibetan interest.
So do you believe anything positive has come out of that Clinton visit to China for the Tibetans?
Something negative has come out of it, in that while it was not his business, Bill Clinton went on saying, I recognize Tibet as part of China. It's not his business to hand over Tibet. Tibet does not belong to him. The US has on record a history of having recognized Tibet as an independent country. Now, who is he today to go against history and to say that Tibet is part of China?
In 1949, Tibet was still a feudal society of peasants ruled by monks and nuns. So, say the Chinese, they invaded Tibet to liberate it from its backward class system. Since then, however, more than 1 million Tibetans have died from imprisonment, torture and starvation. During the 60s, China launched a campaign to wipe out Tibetan culture. 6,000 monasteries were systematically destroyed. That's 90% of Tibet's religious architecture gone. For centuries, this region of Ladakh was part of Tibet. Ironically, it's now more Tibetan than Tibet, precisely because it's not been subjected to Chinese rule. Up until the mid-70s, Ladakh was closed to all foreigners, and it still remains one of the most remote spots on the Indian Himalaya. It sits right on the border of China and Pakistan, so it's politically sensitive and heavily patrolled by the Indian military. But for thousands of Tibetan exiles, it's an ancient land of Buddhism that's now become their second home. Here, religion and land have become one. Monasteries rise like mountain peaks, and even the rocks are carved with prayers. Prayer flags and stupas abound, shrines to the Buddhist teachings of love, peace and compassion. Tibet lies just over these mountains, impossible to forget. The locals here, the Ladakhis, remain devout Buddhists and big fans of the Dalai Lama. Today, the Dalai Lama is on the road, bound for a remote alpine monastery. Every village along the way is out in force to welcome him. Way up in Chumatung, they've been waiting in the sun for hours for that first sign of his motorcade. For 10 years now, the Dalai Lama has made it clear he wants autonomy, not full independence for Tibet. It's a compromise position he's adopted of self-rule within Greater China.
But the one important thing we should not forget, that is, while you make good relation, genuine good friendship, certain point, certain principle matter, such as human right and democracy, religious freedom, these should make very clear and should be very firm on these matters. So here should be some kind of a middle way.
But the middle way no longer commands the support of all Tibetans. The community is now divided. In the streets of Delhi this year, there's been unprecedented protest. Frustration and anger are growing amongst this younger generation of educated Tibetans. After 40 years, they're tired of the calls for non-violence. China still refuses to negotiate, and for these Tibetans, direct action is the only way to free Tibet.
Buddhist philosophy is not some new age vague pacifist notion when you do not have any responsibilities. I'm not a Buddhist scholar, but I have it from very good authority that the Buddha said you cannot use non-violence as a pretext not to do anything when the life of your mother is at stake.
800 kilometres north of Delhi, nestled in the lower Himalaya, is the town of Dharamsala. This is the heart of the Tibetan exile community. It's here that the Dalai Lama spends most of his time. In the surrounding hills, more than 6,000 Tibetan refugees have set up home. Lasang Sering runs a bookstore in Dharamsala. For many years he led the Tibetan Youth Congress, the political movement behind this year's string of protests.
It's a question of misplaced hopes, of wishful thinking, hoping the Chinese will change their mind, hoping India will do something, the United Nations will do something, the US will do something. I would rather have leaders and politicians say, we are not going to take up the Tibetan issue, it does not coincide with our perceived national interest. That would bring home the truth to us.
Lasang Sering is also annoyed by the Western mythology of Shangri-La and the meek and mild Tibetans. He says there's a long history of armed resistance to invasion, and that nowadays many would support an armed struggle against the Chinese.
Not only support, I wait and long to participate in this armed struggle. The only problem is this has to be a national decision. I, as an individual, cannot.
It was in this refugee camp in Ladakh that we found one of Tibet's old warriors. Wanjak Tashi fought in the Tibetan resistance in the 50s, when the Chinese invaded his homelands in southern Tibet. He was eventually captured and jailed. There he was constantly tortured by Chinese prison guards.
Di thakwa de geba de puri yo ma soma kya de mi jipchi ge chitu godi kyuni to pale nimol dongore sena la yo ti jebo jam de so den to ge ti ji yon sena dongore na mi rokpa chi minda chor ngi nani mi rere jendi ge ngaji ndo ji lakwa ni zan menda ja ji chik te se ure ngaji ta go chosona lamson kole sombo mi ha ya jore gaji ta go chosona sai no sombo ko ya jore
After 8 years in jail, Wanjak Tashi managed to escape. But not before he'd fallen victim to the Chinese policy of population control. So, would the Dalai Lama disapprove of his fighting past? Wanjak Tashi thinks not.
That's what you use when you're praying.
Nowadays, all that's left of Tibet's warrior tradition is this small battalion, based in the Himalaya and part of the Indian Army. Until the mid-70s, thousands of Tibetan soldiers like these were trained by the CIA and the Indian government for any future military conflict with China. But America lost interest once the Cold War was over, and the Indians now use these paratroopers in their war against Pakistan. As a teenager, Lasang Sering trained at one of the CIA bases. For him, armed resistance is a necessary part of any freedom struggle.
I call this my 4 humble truths. 1, that freedom is a basic necessity for the dignity and honor of human beings. It is as basic as air and water. 2, that freedom will not come by waiting. 3, that therefore it must be fought in one. And 4, freedom is not free. And freedom must be paid for in the currency of life and blood. And unless this generation is willing and able to pay this price, the next generation cannot be free.
This year's hunger strike proved there's no shortage of Tibetans now willing to pay the ultimate price. During 49 days, these 6 volunteers went without food. Outside, hundreds more signed up to replace them should they die. It was a desperate attempt to force the Tibetan issue onto the international agenda. And it was in direct defiance of the Dalai Lama's teaching that suicide is a form of violence. The youngest striker, Karma Sitcho, lost his hearing and eyesight and developed long-term medical problems. Now he's back in Dharamsala recovering and dealing with what he calls the torment of unfinished business. How do you feel about the fact that the Dalai Lama says that fasting to death is a form of violence? In fact, the Dalai Lama didn't try and stop the hunger strike. This time he admitted he had no alternative to offer. Dharamsala is united in its support for the hunger strikers. In May of this year, the whole town was shocked and mobilised by one man's unforgettable act of sacrifice. It's beside this prayer wheel that the Tibetan Youth Congress have started to build this memorial to Thupten Nodup. It was Thupten who burnt himself alive at the end of a long hunger strike for Tibetan freedom. Now, to people everywhere, he's become a martyr and a hero. And there are thousands of Tibetans who say they now too are willing to die to save their country.
Suzuki Lusodi Pu Sai Tuki Tundata, Energy, Zamindinala, Chick, Shide Yungaji Tunda, Energy, Ransolo Della, Naraine, Chick, Gundato, Semla Samde, Energy, Narana Labjaji, Samsaji, Energy Kala or Koraki de Lusodi Pujet Haslata.
The hunger strike was coordinated by the Tibetan Youth Congress. They're the radical wing of the Tibetan movement, and they advocate full independence.
We should do something more active, something more forceful, so that we are getting this sort of message from our youngsters.
It's not only the question of Tibetan people who 130,000 Tibetans who are living here in exile want to go back to Tibet, but it's a question of 6 million Tibetans who want a peace in this world.
So what he did for the country, so it's a good lesson for all the Tibetans.
Like a role model,
yeah.
People taking him on as a role model.
Yeah.
The Youth Congress only halted the hunger strike when several countries promised to raise the issue of Tibet in the United Nations. But they say if those promises are broken, the hunger strike will resume.
So we are giving a lesson to the Chinese that you should, now it's the high time for you to come forward to have a dialogue. Otherwise, we might choose violence also.
There are now, you see, some change, some positive change might come in near future. Near future does not mean next month or next year, but you see, I think the positive things are developing.
But Your Holiness, recently we've seen the hunger strikes, the self-immolation. Obviously many Tibetans are feeling very frustrated and desperate that time is running out.
Yes, there are people among the youth as well as among the elder who are now showing some kind of signs of frustration. It's understandable. But I feel if they look from wider perspective, wider angle, then there are also many signs of the positive, signs of hopes also there.
Each year, more and more refugees end up here at Dharamsala's refugee centre. Each one of them will be received and blessed personally by the Dalai Lama. While some Tibetans have benefited economically under Chinese rule, it's clear that for these people, life was intolerable. 5,000 have arrived in the last 12 months. Here are children forbidden to speak Tibetan at school, women forced onto sterilisation programs, husbands imprisoned for attending political demonstrations. What's immediately obvious here too is the large number of monks and nuns, new targets of China's re-education campaign. This monk tells of how the re-education teams force monks to sign documents disclaiming the Dalai Lama, denouncing him as a separatist. Like most of these refugees, he risked death to cross the Himalayan mountains to reach Nepal and then India. Upstairs, we meet a distraught young woman whose mother was jailed by the Chinese because she tried to help a monk escape to India. Since her mother was jailed, one by one each family member was dismissed from their jobs. And so, she says, she's here to try and earn money to send back home. In Dharamsala, many of the refugee children are essentially orphans, sent from Tibet by parents desperate to give them a Tibetan education. Here at the Children's Village School, they're educated, housed and fed under a system established by the Dalai Lama and his sister. It now caters for 12,000 Tibetan children throughout India. Kunling Thupten was one of Tibet's foremost opera singers, forced to escape in 1959. In Tibet, Chinese policy has seen the Tibetan language removed from nearly every level of education. Here, the children are taught Tibetan language and culture, as well as a modern curriculum. The Dharamsala community has also established its own de facto government, in operation since the early days of exile. The Tibetan parliament in exile has a draft constitution waiting to be approved should autonomy ever be achieved. In the meantime, there are departments and ministries, a parliamentary charter, and the beginnings of a judiciary. Tencho Gyalpo is a member of parliament and the Dalai Lama's niece. She admits the government in exile is still in its infancy.
We have trying to build a very democratic society where a parliament is elected, which elects the cabinet, and we have a government in exile that works very democratically, where the presence of His Holiness may not even be necessary.
The 14th Dalai Lama.
In Martin Scorsese's film Kundun, Tencho Gyalpo plays the role of the Dalai Lama's mother.
Very auspicious 14th Dalai Lama.
And in fact, I play my own grandmother in the film. And as a little